Welcome to the University of Nottingham. Aristotle, probably the most famous and greatest of the Greek philosophers, has influenced Christian theology throughout its history. For St. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, he was simply the philosopher. But why should theologians study Aristotle? With me is Dr. Simon Oliver. You work on Aristotle and you work on the influence of Aristotle on Christian theology. Why has he influenced Christian theology, and is that a good thing?
Okay. Well, Aristotle, first of all, if we go back to his origins, he was a pupil of Plato, very famously, and himself a teacher, founder of his own school of philosophy in ancient Athens. The curious thing about Aristotle is that so far as we know, his texts were largely unknown to the very early theologians of the Christian tradition. I believe that recent scholarship suggests that there are more Aristotelian trends than we previously thought in, for example, St. Augustine, writing at the end of the 4th century, the beginning of the 5th century. But the standard reading is that Aristotle is lost to the Latin-speaking West until around the 12th century, but he's not lost to the Islamic scholars. So the Islamic scholars pick up Aristotelian works and translate them into Arabic, and particularly Aristotle's works on nature, his physics, but also his metaphysics, his work on animals, his natural history, if you like. And Christian theologians, missionaries, go particularly into the Islamic libraries of northern Spain, and they find these texts in the 12th century. And they begin to translate them out of Arabic into Latin. And they think, goodness me, there's something here. This is very, very interesting. This gives us most particularly a philosophical approach to nature that's very, very powerful. And so these texts into Latin begin to be read by Christian theologians in the 12th and 13th centuries, particularly by Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln, one of the first Latin commentators on Aristotle, then by Albert the Great, and in turn his pupil Thomas Aquinas. And they begin to assimilate this Aristotelian philosophy in order to help them understand more deeply the meaning and implications of Sacra Doctrina, as Aquinas called it, holy teaching, the holy teaching of the Church. And so famously, what a lot of viewers of this film will know about, particularly if they've studied Aquinas at A level, is that Aquinas uses Aristotle's physics in his 5 ways, for his so-called 5 ways for proving God's existence. He uses Aristotle's understanding of motion, his understanding of the goal-orientated aspects of the cosmos, of what we call the teleology of the cosmos, to understand how God creates and why creation itself leads inexorably to the conclusion that God exists. The difficulty with Aristotle in the 13th century is that a lot of the things he taught seem to contradict squarely Christian teaching. So in particular, the typical example is that Aristotle thought that the universe was of everlasting time, it had always been, whereas Christian teaching was that there was a moment of creation out of nothing, and that this therefore is in contradiction, and therefore Aristotelian philosophy, in being pagan and coming prior to the supreme revelation held in Christian theology, ought to be dispensed with. So a lot of Aristotelian teachings, propositions are condemned at the end of the 13th century, not long after Aquinas died.
Only 3 years,
Only 3 years, in fact. So 1277, with the Bishop of Paris, Etienne Tempier, he condemns a lot of Aristotelian teachings. We're not quite sure what provoked that, but something did provoke it. But the very strange thing is that Aristotle returns with a vengeance in the Renaissance. So he becomes the definitive figure of study in Renaissance universities. Aristotelian science reigns supreme until the 16th century, when figures such as Galileo come along and offer a completely different way of approaching the natural world. But what Aristotle presents us with is if you like, a whole synthesis of a whole range of philosophical problems, very elegantly solved through a metaphysical framework. So he gives us, for example, understandings of causation, that if we talk about the different modes into which cause falls, as Aristotle puts it, we can talk about the material cause of something, the matter out of which something is made. We can talk about its formal cause, what that thing is in itself, if you like, the form that is given to it. We can talk about the final cause, the purpose for which something comes to be. For example, I create a sculpture in order to decorate my hallway. And we can talk about the efficient cause, which is, as it were, the pushes and pulls or the events or the actions that give rise to something.
Can I just stop you there? We tend to think of a cause in terms of sort of I remember when I was an undergraduate, I first heard the word causality. I thought of a sort of a shunting engine in a railway station, and the wagon is there and the shunter comes up and gives it a push, and that makes it move on. So we tend to think of cause as sort of shunting and local motion. Can you go into the notion of cause a little bit more for us?
Well, Aristotle calls that the efficient cause, and that's typically how modern philosophy and science will think about causation. So
to get a nail into a piece of wood, you have to hit it with a hammer, and the hitting of the hammer and all the force that you can explain with physics is the efficient cause, getting the nail into the wood.
Exactly. So typically it's the event immediately preceding the cause. So the tectonic plates shift and they cause the earthquake. Yeah. So we talk about causation in terms of events. Well, Aristotle says, yes, that is an account of causation, but it's incomplete. So if we really want to understand a process, most particularly what we have to do is understand what he calls the why of it. Why does it take place? What's the purpose? And that's what he calls the final cause. It's what we today call teleology, a phrase that arises in the 18th century in German philosophy, the study of final causes, purposes. Why do I go to the shop in order to buy a sandwich to satisfy my hunger? Why do you drive the nail into the wood in order to make the shelf mount the wall? So it's always this in order to, the purpose. So Aristotle will see purposiveness behind the whole of created, the whole of the universe, not simply human intentionality, not simply human purposiveness, but the purposiveness of the whole of nature. And it's that notion of the purposiveness of the whole of nature that falls away in modern philosophy and science. But it's absolutely critical to the Christian theological imagination, because Christian theology is still committed to the idea that in some sense God creates things for a purpose, but in creating them he orientates them always to certain ends. Acorns to oaks, boys to man, creation to union with its divine creator.
And it's worth saying that the idea that God creates with a purpose is actually another way of saying that God creates in love, because you love to a purpose. So it's not some sort of add-on. Oh, he created. Oh, and he just didn't do it for fun, but it's actually built into the very core of.
Exactly, and the purposiveness of creation is not something that comes, as it were, after the fact. It's not. It's God doesn't create and then layer on top of it a purpose or a design. In fact, what God does, the whole purposiveness of every natural thing, both the purposiveness of individual entities and cosmic purpose, are knit into the whole fabric of creation. And this is what, Thomas Aquinas sees this in the 13th century and thinks, my goodness, that's an enormously powerful tool for expositing precisely what you say, the notion that God creates in love. And so Aquinas doesn't slavishly follow Aristotle at all, but he uses Aristotelian philosophy, and he calls him the philosopher, as you say, which is, to be called a philosopher in the 13th century is a very derogatory term. Philosophers are pagans. What they have is entirely prior to the treasures of Christian revelation. But Aquinas thinks that he can, to use the classic metaphor, turn the water of philosophy into the wine of Christian theology. So he's taking the water of Aristotle's philosophy, as good as it could be, and turning it into the wine of Christian theology.
We could go on for a long time talking about various aspects of Aristotle and his impact, but I think I'd like to finish with that lovely image. Simon, thank you very much.